So again, thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to what I hope will be a useful and productive conversation. And I think we can keep this pretty informal. So I might pause to ask you all some questions, and you're all welcome to ask me questions throughout the talk as well, either through the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, or just unmute and ask, whatever sort of works for you. So I'll talk more by what I mean by computational social science in just a minute, but I wanted to start with a question for all of you. If you feel so moved, I would be interested if you want to put in the chat sort of what do you think are the most important skills for computational social science? And you can just put sort of the first thing that comes to mind. It can be general or vague. It can be very specific, whatever you want. Coding. Mm-hmm. Attention to detail. Oh, that's a good one. Coding is also good. These are all good. Programming skills are Python. Patience. Yes, I'm loving seeing this range of things. Okay, fantastic. People can continue adding things if you feel so moved, but I will move on and sort of show you my list of answers. Problem solving, curiosity. Yeah, these are all really, really great things. So this is the list that I made in advance of this talk of sort of the things that came to my mind with that prompt. And I was curious to see what things you all thought and sort of what came to mind for you. But I put sort of what I see as the core skills here, roughly in order of importance. So first, I think we need an appreciation for what I call data justice. And I'll talk more about what that means sort of over the course of this talk. Second, computational social science really requires intellectual humility and scientific skepticism. And I think this is true for any science, but I'll talk about it, particularly why it's important in the context of computational social science. And then finally, we do need a familiarity with algorithmic approaches. So I saw many of the answers had to do with programming skills or coding. And while I do think that sort of often the first thing that comes to mind, I do want to note that it's not accidental that I put that at the bottom of this list. It's definitely an important skill, but I would argue that it is not the most important. And in a sense of why I would argue that, I think it's helpful to back up a bit and think more about exactly what we mean by computational social science. And I won't make you answer this time, but I'll just give my definition. So, there's not a set definition, so other people might define it slightly differently. But the definition I like to use is that computational social science is the meaningful and ethical development of computational methods for revisiting and reimagining social science questions. And again, you can see sort of those three core skills sort of implicitly embedded in this definition. So it is absolutely essential that this work be ethical. You can certainly do unethical work, but it's definitely not good computational social science, and it's frankly just bad work if you do that. But also this work is about revisiting and reimagining social science questions, asking old questions, but with new data or new approaches, or asking entirely new questions that people haven't really had the opportunity to ask before. And that kind of work is really hard and really challenging, excuse me, and it requires a lot of trial and error. There are many choices that researchers need to make through the process of doing that kind of work, and other people may disagree with their choices. And in fact, as part of the scientific process, there should be a collegial process of disagreement where people are continually asking questions like, okay, well, what would happen if you made a slightly different choice? What would be the impact of that change or that choice? And doing that process really requires intellectual humility and a recognition that absolutely none of us can do this work on our own. When we ask questions, and also when we are asked questions, it should always come from a place of partnership, of collegiality, and of recognizing that we're all advancing this work together. Absolutely none of us are right, quote unquote. And it's really only through this process of asking and answering questions that we can collectively learn. And finally, yes, computational social science is about using and developing computational methods. So that's definitely a key piece of this work as well. So I wanted to start with that because when I ask people who are interested in getting into this field what they think the hardest thing about computational social science is, I often get answers about the computational element. So things like algorithms and statistics and machine learning seem really scary and really hard to break into. And, to be honest, there are a lot of structural barriers in the way. So for myself, I'm a first gen to college student, and I have some other demographic features that really led me to grow up feeling like I wasn't sort of a quote unquote math person. And I spent my whole life in a society that constantly told me that I could not succeed in this work, and that even if I did, I definitely wasn't welcome. And I am on the relatively privileged end of things. So I know there are many people who experience this even more acutely than I do. So, to be honest, dealing with that element of things is definitely hard, but the actual math itself is not, and it's not the hard part of this work. And that brings me to the element that really is challenging about computational social science. At its core, a lot of science is about trying to simplify and summarize a complex world. And when it's real human beings that you're simplifying and summarizing, and your work can have impact on real human beings, you need to think a lot about issues of power and privilege, of intersectionality, of what you're measuring, who you're not measuring, and what kind of impacts your work can have. So I do think that both of these elements are important, but really the core of doing good computational social science work is more this element of thinking about sort of the ethical elements of what you're doing and the kinds of impacts it can have. So I know there are a lot of people in the audience who are interested in computational social science. So I just wanted to say, please don't let the methods and machinery deter you. You absolutely can understand and master those approaches. And particularly if you're inclined to ask questions about ethics and power, we really need you. So please come be a computational social scientist if you want to. Also, I appreciate the land acknowledgement that Allison gave earlier. I also wanted to pause for a moment to give my own land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you from New York University right now, where I live and work on the ancestral homes of the Lenape people. McMaster University, as Allison mentioned, is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and I practiced this beforehand, still got caught up. Haudenosaunee nations, there we go. And within the lands protected by the A Dish with One Spoon agreement. And it's important to recognize that these lands do have continued significance for Indigenous populations, and that these populations continue to face deep structural inequities of exclusion and erasure. I can't change the colonial history of either of our countries, but I can acknowledge that I have and frankly continue to benefit from the violence that was perpetrated against these nations. My life and my work would simply not be possible without the use of their land. And I wanted to pause for that because such land acknowledgements are really essential and tie into the principle of data justice, which again, I believe is a crucial element for doing good computational social science work. And again, I'll talk a little bit more in more detail about what that phrase means in just a minute. But all three of these skills are really interconnected in a lot of ways. So I want to tell you a few stories which highlight their importance. And my first story begins with a map. So this is a map of McMaster University. I got it off the university's official webpage for visitors. And I have two questions for all of you. So my first question is this map an exact representation of campus? And you're welcome to answer in the chat. I have never been to your campus, so you're going to have to help me out here. Is this an exact representation of campus? It's approximate. Yeah, so if I close enough is also a good answer. Yeah, so no is what I was saying here. I was guessing at least that if I were to actually walk around campus, I would find things that are not denoted. So I might find walkways or flowers or elements of architecture, things that aren't captured in this map. The map itself is actually far more complex than this. So my next question is this map a useful representation of campus? And as many of the previous answers sort of implied, the answer I'm going for here is yes, but you might also reasonably say no. And a very important question, sort of follow-up question that you might ask is useful for what? So this map is useful if I want to visit campus and I need to know what address to put in my GPS or need to find parking or a specific building, but it's not useful if I want to understand how indigenous nations used this land before the university existed. So this map is useful for some things, but is not useful for other things. And what I'm saying here is that a map which isn't exact can still be useful, or more generally, you may have heard the expression that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So that is true, but I would actually take it a step further and say that a map or model which is useful cannot be exact. That in order for it to be useful, it cannot be exact. And this idea comes in part from a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, which you can see here in its entirety. It is a very short story, so you're welcome to Google it and read the whole thing later. But it tells the story of a group of cartographers who were so dedicated to perfection in their craft that they, quote, struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire and which coincided point for point with it. In other words, they didn't really make a map, they made a replica of the empire that they were supposedly mapping. And the story tells that future generations found that this map, although it was perfect in some respects, was not at all useful because it really couldn't function as a map any more than sort of the original empire could. It was just too detailed, too precise, and also was almost surely immediately out of date as soon as one flower died or one rock shifted. Yeah, and thank you, Michelle, for putting the note in the comment. There's the comment in the chat. There's other stories by this author that sort of have similar themes, and I think it's a helpful way of thinking about this, that an exact model, while it may be excellently detailed, is actually not useful at all. And what really makes a map, or really any model, useful is its ability to summarize and synthesize complex information for a specific purpose. So how much detail a map needs really depends on its scale and its purpose. A campus map can show specific buildings, a regional map can show major roads, and a country map can highlight different regions. All of these maps simplify and summarize a complex reality, but they do so in ways that are useful for specific tasks, which help us navigate or roughly understand our surroundings in some way. And if we don't simplify these complexities, then our model will not be able to help us understand it. The real challenge then, particularly when it comes to the social sciences, is that when you're working with, studying, or impacting real human populations, the people and details which you're quote unquote simplifying over are real things which really matter. And a lot of the time, the things that we simplify over are populations and identities which are already marginalized. So doing so only further serves to erase and invalidate their experiences. So while in many respects, this simplification is essential, you really can't study people in all their true complexity. You also do have to be mindful and thoughtful about what kinds of simplifications you're making and how you present it. So as an example of this challenge, here's a figure from one of my own papers. So I'll just call myself out here a little bit. And the specific details of this figure aren't that important, but it's broadly showing Twitter users within the United States compared to sort of the full US population. And then also Twitter users for specific topics. So again, this is a simplification of reality. So we could easily sort of look at this plot and see many things that are wrong with it. So for example, there are only 2 genders included, so we're definitely missing some identities there. This also isn't a complete list of racial identities, and there's absolutely no representation of multiracial people here. There's also no consideration of intersectionality, of the fact that people inhabit multiple identities. So while this chart can tell me something about the behavior of Black people, and it can tell me something about the behavior of women, it can't really tell me anything about the behavior of Black women as a category. And that's important because that group of people does have distinctive experiences and face unique intersectional oppression, which is not identical to the experiences of either Black people as a whole or women as a whole. So by sort of overlooking that intersectional category, there's a lot of important elements and identities which have been simplified out of this plot. So the next question is, does that mean we should never use a plot like this? So I already told you that this is from one of my own papers, so I guess you know that I think it's okay to sometimes make these kinds of simplifications. But again, I think it depends a lot on what you want the plot to be useful for. So this plot is part of a larger paper, and my goal with this plot in particular was to give the reader a high-level sense of how the populations of Twitter compares to the full US population. And I personally think that it is useful for that. It certainly does not provide nuanced insight into how different populations use Twitter, and there's a lot that it cannot tell us. But I do think it's helpful for like a specific narrow thing. And it's important to think about what it is useful for and to acknowledge those limitations and contextualize them. And I would also say that it's important to recognize that while I personally think that this plot is useful, many people may not agree with me. They might think it's way too oversimplified, and that some of the populations that are missing from this plot should never be erased in the way I have done here. I don't necessarily have to change my plot because of that criticism, but I do need to acknowledge that as a valid and reasonable criticism that people might have. So a key tension that's been sort of repeatedly implied here is that data and data analysis is often assumed or interpreted to be neutral. That if I show you data, it is sort of capital T true, and it's a perfect representation of the world. But as we've seen, that is not true, and data is really not neutral. It's the result of numerous choices about data collection, aggregation, and presentation. And treating it as if it were true is simply wrong and inaccurate. A useful map cannot be exact, and your data analysis will never, ever be a perfect representation of reality. But many people will interpret it as if it is. So that's something that you need to be careful about. So here's an example of that, particularly looking at the challenge of presenting data. And this comes from a really excellent book, Feminism, by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, and they got this example from the New York Times. So both these plots show the same data. If you look at the gray line, it's exactly the same across both plots. But the version on the left emphasizes that the unemployment rate has been dropping, which is favorable to Democrats. And the version on the right shows that unemployment has been elevated for several months, a framing which is favorable to Republicans. The key thing is that both of these things are true. And even if I were to show you a plot that had no shading and sort of no lines indicating what's going on, a reasonable reader might look at this plot and interpret it either as being favorable to Democrats or to Republicans, and then they might walk away from that plot feeling like they had the only right interpretation of the data and that their view is backed up by the data. So even when it's sort of supposedly neutral, data really isn't neutral and can be subjective in terms of how it's interpreted. Here's another example, which is also taken from Data Feminism. So this is a map which was created by Gwendolyn Warren and the Detroit Geographical Expedition and Institute in partnership with many young people in Detroit. And the title of this map is, quote, "Where commuters run over Black children on the Point's downtown track." Each plot or each point on this map indicates a vehicle accident and fatality. And the people who lived in this neighborhood knew that there was a serious problem with vehicle safety, but they couldn't get the government to do anything about it because basically the government didn't really think that it was a real thing that was happening. So they ultimately conducted their own data collection and mapped all of these accidents or all of these incidents, and eventually did get the government to respond with implementing several safety measures. But again, this data would probably not have been collected if they hadn't done it themselves. And so what questions get asked and what data is collected is also not neutral and depends on sort of who has the ability to ask questions and collect data and who has sort of the power to do those things. So again, data is not neutral. So when you're doing computational social science, it really is absolutely essential to ask questions like, who generated the data? How or why is it generated? What is counted and what is not? And what impact might this analysis have and whose voices are included? These are really essential elements of computational social science. And doing this well requires both intellectual humility and a commitment to data justice. Okay, so I'll finally give a brief definition of what I mean by data justice. So many formal institutions of data ethics work off the premise that you should do no harm. And that's certainly great. Let's not do harm, but it's also not enough. So while unfortunately there is a lot of harm being done, from issues of data privacy to algorithmic bias to the spread of misinformation, if we're going to do computational social science, we definitely don't want to be part of the problem. But data justice also means that we have an opportunity to work towards undoing some of the existing harm, that we can use our work and our computational skills to leave the world better than we found it. And what I'm really saying here is that data scientists have tremendous power to shape the kinds of questions we're asked or that are asked, how these questions are asked, and how results are shared and interpreted. So working with data comes with tremendous power. So of course, I am now obligated to say that with great power comes great responsibility. So being committed to data justice means constantly asking questions like, what can we learn from this data? What are we assuming? What are we simplifying out? And how can we do better? And it means not only asking these questions of yourself, but asking these questions of others. And it means listening when people ask you. It also means believing people's lived experiences and finding ways to demonstrate and amplify that experience when possible, to present people's experiences as data so that other people will believe it as well, because sometimes you need sort of data, even though it is not neutral, to convince people of a point. So again, this is absolutely essential to doing good computational social science. So finally, I've spent a lot of time on these first two skills. So in the last half of this talk, I do want to spend some time talking about common algorithmic approaches. So we're going to get into some math here, but don't be scared. And I also want to note that I do think this is the kind of thing where you often need to be exposed to it several times before it really starts to click. So if you feel like you're not quite catching everything that I'm going over, don't worry about it too much. It's totally normal. You absolutely can learn these approaches if you want to, and it may look scary, but again, this actually is the easy part. Although when I say it's the easy part, oh, sorry. There's sound that came up for me. When I say it's the easy part, as you learn these methods and skills, being good at coding, it doesn't really look the way it does in the movies. You don't just sit down and type everything perfectly the first time through. So coding really, like, if you don't feel like this when you code, like, that is totally normal. In reality, it often looks a little bit more like this, where there's a lot of mistakes that you make along the way. So you make mistakes, you fix those mistakes, you make some more mistakes, and then you fix those mistakes too. You get a lot of errors, but you get better at debugging those errors and slowly work towards having a program which does the things you want. But it definitely doesn't come all at once, and it comes with a lot of frustration and a lot of failure. But that is just what it looks like, and you're not doing it wrong if that's how you experience it. The other thing I want to note is that there's a lot of different terminology which is used inconsistently. So different fields have different terms that they use. Sometimes terms will be used interchangeably. Sometimes they'll be used to indicate slightly different things. A lot of these terms don't have like universal definitions that everybody agrees to. So that can also be a barrier and be really frustrating. But it takes some practice, but as you spend more time sort of working in this field and learning these terms, you'll start to understand sort of roughly what people mean when they say different things. Okay, so with all that being said, there are basically two major types of sort of algorithmic approaches or machine learning. So there's supervised learning, where we know both the input and at least some of the output. These methods are particularly useful when we want to estimate the effect of an input on an output, or we want to predict output labels for new data. So it's supervised in the sense that we know at least some of our output values before we start. In unsupervised learning, on the other hand, we only know the input and we're trying to learn patterns in that input. So we don't really have an output at all, but we're basically looking for patterns just within our input. So I just threw around a whole bunch of terms like input and output, and I've denoted them here as X and Y. So now I'm going to back up a little bit and talk more broadly about what our data might look like. So imagine we have this simple data set, and you can imagine this data to be about whatever you want. This could be a list of students and their exam scores, or a list of gamers and time to complete different levels, or it could be a list of tweets and information about those tweets, like how many words they have, or if specific words are used, or the sentiment of that tweet. So anyway, this data set can be anything. And in this data set. Each row tells us about a given observation. So this row is telling us about observation A. This row is telling us about observation C. And each column gives us information about a given characteristic. So this one, I've labeled this column val1 generically. So if this were test scores, this could be like everybody's score on the first exam or something like that. And this column would give us information about what I've labeled val3. So in other words, this data set can be understood as a matrix or also as a collection of vectors. And so with that, you might be wondering, what's a vector? So a vector is an object that has both magnitude and direction. So one way we can visualize that, we imagine we have a two-dimensional space. So here we've got one dimension along the horizontal axis and a second dimension along the vertical axis. A vector might look like this. So it is something that has a magnitude or a length and a direction within this space. So given such a vector, you may then wonder, how would we describe the magnitude and direction of this vector? And you've probably had to do things in math class before where you look at sort of the angle between the vector and the axis and sort of use the quadratic equation to figure out the length of the hypotenuse and all that stuff. But we can actually do something way easier here. So if we're using this two-dimensional space, we can describe this vector, which starts at the origin, the 0, 0 point. So we can describe this vector based off the coordinates of its endpoint. So here, we'll describe this vector as simply 2, 3, where 2 is its coordinate in the first dimension and 3 is its coordinate in the second dimension. So here, we basically get a table where that table gives us the vector coordinate of a given observation. So we can imagine doing this with multiple observations where each observation describes a vector within this two-dimensional space. And again, we see that like each row of this table gives us information about a given observation. So we can look at A, we can look at C, we can look at information, any of these observations, we can sort of see exactly where it is within this two-dimensional space. And we could then expand, it's harder to visualize, but we can imagine expanding this into multiple dimensions or sort of an arbitrary number of n dimensions. So if we have four-dimensional space, we could have a much larger table where now we have, again, each row is telling us sort of information about a given observation, but it's giving us a vector, which is telling us a position in some four-dimensional space. So these dimensions are often called features of our data. And if we use these features as input, we may also denote them as X or as the independent variable, which is then often abbreviated to IVs. And this terminology basically all means the same thing. So X, input, independent variable, IV, it's all the same. If we use a feature as output, we may also denote it as Y or as the dependent variable or DV. And again, these terms all mean the same thing. And I do also want to note that while we can have multiple features as input, we typically only have one feature as output. So to give an example of how this might work and what we might do with this data, let's imagine we have a slightly larger data set. So for each observation, we're able to measure some of the features, but we want to predict the true false labels for the remaining feature. So in this example, what I've labeled dim4 would be our output vector or our Y vector. And dimensions 1 through 3 are each input vectors, which together form a matrix or an input matrix. And when we're talking about a matrix, it's basically a data set where we're just ignoring the labels and just looking at the values. So we basically made it this mathematical object by only looking at the numerical entries. We still know which column corresponds to which feature and which row corresponds to which observation, but we're just sort of ignoring those labels for the time being and treating it as this sort of mathematical object. And when we talk about a vector, we're basically talking about a single column or row where we're then also ignoring labels. So most of machine learning essentially consists of two steps. First, we count or measure things and construct this feature matrix, and then we do math on the resulting matrix. And I put an asterisk there because most of the time the computer is actually doing the math for you. So I want to end with a few examples. So I'll be using this Palmer penguins dataset, which you can Google. It's freely available and involves penguins, so I love it. And it's data that was collected on 3 species of penguins by researchers at Antarctica. So to give you a quick snapshot of what this data looks like, it has information on about 300 penguins. And here's sort of the data table that goes along with it. So again, each row describes the characteristic of a single penguin. So we know the species, what island it was found on, and then various like physical measurements of these penguins. And each column describes a single characteristic of all penguins. So this column here is the bill length in millimeters, and it describes a vector, which gives us the bill length of all of these penguins. So as an example, we'll start by working in 2 dimensions because it's easier to visualize. So we'll just sort of ignore a lot of these columns, and we'll just look at bill length and flipper length. So for this example, we'll take the bill length as our input vector or x vector, and we'll take the flipper length as our output vector. So I've plotted them here with bill length on the x or horizontal axis and flipper length on the vertical or y-axis. Now, given this data, we could draw a line through it essentially. And I won't go through the details here of how we would actually fit that line, but essentially you want to draw a line that reasonably describes the data. I think you can sort of visualize where that line might go just from looking at this data. And once we have drawn that line, then if we see a new x value, we can predict its corresponding y value. So here, if I see an x value of about 45 millimeters, I can basically just like draw a line or like go up until I hit my fit line and then see what the y coordinate is of that. And this is basically linear regression. So it's a simple but very powerful approach. And again, we could expand this to having more dimensions and do multiple regression. So here we have a matrix that describes each penguin in 3-dimensional space as our input matrix, and then we have an output vector, which describes an additional dimension that is associated with each penguin. And if we sort of can imagine this multi-dimensional space, we could again sort of fit a line from our input to this output, and that would allow us to predict new output values for any new input that we saw. So if we got bill length, bill depth, and flipper length for a new penguin, we could predict, in this example, its body mass, which is our output vector. So anytime you're talking to somebody or reading a paper, if they say something like, we used a supervised linear model in order to estimate, it basically just means that they fit a line to their data. This is something like, and most of the time it'll be regression. There are other linear models, but regression was one of those things that I was really scared of, and it sounded really scary, but it literally just means like drawing a line through your data. And again, I won't go through the details of how to draw that line, but like turns out not that complicated. You draw a line. Okay. So that was an example of supervised learning. I also want to quickly go through an example of unsupervised learning. So again, in these approaches, we have observations. So we have our attributes or our features or our X matrix or IVs, whatever you want to call it. And we don't have, or we're not thinking about output. We're just using this input data. And we don't know the labels. We may not know sort of how many categories there are, but basically we're looking for similarities or patterns within this data. So I'll particularly talk about k-means clustering. And the core idea here is that observations, which are in the same clusters, will be reasonably close together in whatever sort of n-dimensional space we're working in, and that those clusters will be reasonably distinct. So things will be close to things that are in their same cluster and far from things that are not in their same cluster. So the way this algorithm works is you have to start by choosing the number of clusters that you want to find. We'll call that k. Then you select k random points and assign them as centroids. So essentially say that those points are the center of our cluster, of a cluster. Then we assign each data point to the closest centroid to it. And then, this is the fun part, we recompute the centroid based off those clusters. And so those centroids might move based off the clusters that have been identified. And then we just do those over and over again until that centroid point stops moving. So I'll show this again with penguins as an example. So once again, here is a sort of snapshot of the data set. And let's, for this example, just pretend that we don't know the species. We just have sort of physical measurements of a whole bunch of penguins. Somebody gives us this data set and says, hey, can you tell if any of these penguins are like similar to each other? So we want to do that. We can use basically as many features as we want. So we could use, for example, all 4 of these measurements and sort of work in 4-dimensional space and do the clustering in 4-dimensional space. But again, because I can't visualize things in 4 dimensions, today I'll just use 2 features. So I'll look again specifically at bill length and flipper length. So here is a table that just has sort of those 2 columns. And again, this is just the first few rows. So there's actually like 300 observations total or so. So we'll take those 2 columns and I'll plot this again in 2-dimensional space just so we can see what it looks like. And again, I want to note here that while before we used one of these as our X and one of these as our Y, here we're using them both as input values. So it's, again, this is part of where the terminology starts to get confusing also, because here I've plotted them on sort of X and Y axes, but they're both being used as input values and not as output. So yeah, so there's no output. So basically, again, in unsupervised learning, we're trying to find patterns within this X. So we can sort of imagine the data that we're seeing is all our X data, and we want to find clusters or patterns within this data. So we take this data set, again, we ignore the labels, we treat it as a matrix. So the first step here is first we choose a value for K. I'm also not going to talk today about how to choose a good value of K, but I'm going to choose K equals 3 because I feel like it. So then we choose K random points, or 3 random points in this example. So these red X's indicate the random data points that I selected. You can see they're not very good descriptors of this data at all. They're just totally random. 2 of them are like practically on top of each other. It's kind of a mess. So once I do that, I then assign each data point to its closest centroid, which are these red X's. So the orange cluster basically is the largest one because that one X really is almost in the middle of the full data set. There's a few that are assigned to this blue cluster, and then actually none of these data points are assigned to the purple cluster because it's like basically off the map. It's like a bad starting point, but it's fine. It's fine. We'll do it iteratively and it'll work out. So once we have those, we then recompute the center point of each of those clusters. So we take all the points that have been labeled orange here and find what's sort of the center point in this dimensional space. And we do the same thing with the blue and the same thing with the purple. The purple one doesn't move because it had no points assigned to it to begin with. And then we basically just like shift those red X's based off these new center points. And then we basically do this process iteratively. So this is what it looks like after 2 iterations. So we reassign each point to a cluster. So now that the blue X has moved up a little bit, that other X actually has room to start having some data points assigned to it. So we do start to see some data points assigned to this purple cluster. And the orange cluster has gotten a little bit smaller as the blue cluster has grown a little bit. So this is 2 iterations. And then 3 iterations, we can see it's continuing to shift. 4 iterations, I'm going to start skipping some. So 6 iterations. And now like it's almost split evenly into thirds, like orange is definitely still larger. 8 iterations, continuing to shift more. 10 iterations, 20 iterations, 30 iterations. And what you can see is that by this point, by 20 to 30 iterations, these X's aren't actually moving anymore. And the data set is pretty stable in terms of what it's identified as clusters. So the algorithm will sort of do this iteratively, and then we'll return these cluster assignments. So again, it was able to identify these clusters only using sort of input information, not thinking about an output or sort of trying to predict an output label of any kind. We basically let the data sort of quote unquote find those meaningful clusters for us. We can, however, then manually label these clusters based off information that we have. So imagine that, we did this clustering and then we're trying to figure out what these clusters represent. And then somebody comes in and they're like, oh, actually, I did find the species information for all of those penguins. We could also look at it. And in this example, these clusters do correspond pretty well to the different species of penguins that were being measured. So we can sort of call these clusters the species clusters. But that's sort of a manual labeling. So again, most of machine learning really consists of these two steps where we're just counting and measuring things to construct a matrix and then doing math on that matrix. And again, the core skills needed for computational social science really are an appreciation for data justice and intellectual humility. And I think those are two of the most important skills. And you do need a familiarity with algorithmic approaches, but those really are things that anyone can learn. And I appreciate it that it can be scary. And there's a lot of language that people throw around without defining it. But really, each and every one of you can succeed at this work. So I will stop there, and I really look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Questions, comments? We're really eager to hear from everyone and your reactions to this.
I'll go if that's okay. So one of the things is that in Canada, our undergraduate social science degree programs seldom have the types of college math or science requirements that US-based undergrad and social science have. So outside of economics, most social science graduate students don't have experience with calculus or matrix algebra. Does that matter? And what advice would you have for someone from the social sciences who feels like they don't have a strong or extensive math background but wants to do this type of work? What should they be doing, or how should they get started?
Yeah, that is a really great question. And I mean, it is the kind of thing that, at least in the States, it's often thrown out as a prerequisite. I've had a very unique academic journey, so I feel like linear algebra was not something I really understood until relatively recently. And I honestly think that a lot of the barriers is more around sort of the language of how things are used, and people have a habit of sort of using shorthand for things. Or there's actually a joke in mathematical papers, people will be like, as a trivial exercise left to the reader, you can prove blah, blah, blah. And then people with PhDs in math are reading that being like, wait, how is that trivial? How am I supposed to prove that? But it's this sort of part of the culture of the field is to make things seem like, oh, obviously you can go from A to C and you don't need to talk about B at all. So anyway, I just want to acknowledge, I do think it's challenging, but almost more from that social element. So I would say, if you are in that position, ask lots of questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. You are not stupid if you ask questions. You need to ask questions. If there are things that you feel like you don't understand, the good news is that the internet is full of information. And I think it's easy to get bogged down in you don't have to go Google linear algebra and try and teach yourself linear algebra. But if somebody's doing something and they're like, oh yeah, and then you just, multiply these matrices, then Google okay, so what does it mean to multiply matrices? What is happening when you do that? Ask, if you're not comfortable asking the instructor, ask your peers. And certainly if your peers don't know, then ask the instructor, because clearly nobody knows and the instructor needs to tell you. And I will also say, I think it's a challenge for instructors where, it's hard to go back to how you used to be. So after a while, you kind of get used to oh, yes, I know what all these terms mean and they're obvious to me. And it can be hard to sort of pause and actually explain them in accessible ways. So again, don't be afraid to ask questions. You need to do it. And asking questions is actually a public service, because I promise other people are thinking the same thing and struggling with the same thing. It's just that, there's such a stigma around asking for clarification on things that I appreciate that people are often scared to do it. But if you're not going to do it for yourself, do it for your peers, because they need it too.
One thing that really came up as I was thinking about this and listening to you talk was how important the intersection of people who are using supervised approaches and unsupervised approaches can be for being able to look at any particular issue. So I was thinking about the ways in which people are looking at systemic barriers associated with different demographic factors and the recognition of intersectionality. And you have a lot of people struggling with regression-based methods and finding really interesting things for that using existing demographic categories.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the work that I've been associated with is really focused on clustering and being able to sort of find what groups are having similar kinds of outcomes and not starting from the place of assuming that you know what those groups are.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that like the conversation between the two approaches and the ways in which they're starting to inform each other about how you think and identify demographic
Mm-hmm.
groups feels so much more important than what either those of us on my end or the other end have been doing in isolation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and something that's good to think about where, each of these approaches have sort of different assumptions baked into them about what is important and what you want to find. And it's helpful to use both approaches and also think about, do you find the same things? Do you find different things? And like in the clustering example I showed, I knew that there were 3 species. And so I chose K = 3 because then I could be like, my clusters correspond to species. But by doing that, I'm also ignoring the possibility, like if there's, sexual dimorphism within a species, maybe there should actually be 6 clusters or something like that. And I'm just sort of imposing my view of 3 clusters. So I do think that there are lots of interesting ways that these different approaches can be used together to sort of interrogate some of those assumptions that we're making when we work with data.
Thank you. Any last questions? Comments?
I have another one that's about collaboration. You mentioned everyone can't know all this stuff on their
Mm-hmm.
own. And I think that's really true. And I think one of the reasons it's really important for social scientists to learn at least some of these skills and participate in these projects is because we bring theory that, computer scientists don't have. We have like good theory instead of walking barefoot through the data. So I'm also curious to hear your perspective as a political scientist on kind of who you think you benefit most from collaborating with, or what types of collaborations across disciplines in your experience or in your observation have been kind of most fruitful?
Yeah, that is a great question. I do think there are many kinds of collaborations and many kinds of people who can sort of fill different roles. So I definitely have many collaborations where I am like the social scientist and I need to understand the methods enough to, talk to I'm not necessarily the person actually running the algorithms, but I need to talk to those people and be like, oh, can you try doing this or that or like whatever. And I need to understand it sort of broadly enough to give input and suggestions, but I don't need to actually know how to code it at all. And then I have other collaborations where I am the technical person and I'm the one sort of running the algorithm and trying to figure it out. And the reality is those projects often look very different, where like if I'm the technical person on the project, let's be honest, it's probably not a very technical piece. It has technical elements, but it's not something that we would submit to like a CS conference. It's more of like a social science paper that uses computational methods. Whereas if I'm the social science person, then it's probably something that's like primarily here's an innovation in a different new algorithmic approach. And I'm sort of making it like pointing out why it's important to do this and what the relevancy is to the broader world. And it's more of a technical paper that's grounded in theory. So I personally tend to sort of exist in both of those spaces and alternate between roles based off who I'm co-authoring with and what the goal of a certain piece is. But then many of my co-authors sort of exist primarily on one end of the spectrum. So like I have many collaborators who have PhDs in computer science and they write computer science papers and like that's what they do. And they're always the technical person. I have other colleagues who have PhDs in social science and with less technical training in that social science field. And so they typically are writing more theory-based papers. So I think depending on what is interesting and exciting to you personally, you can sort of exist anywhere in that space. And I guess I would also say I have collaborators who also exist in the middle and then they sort of take turns on each of the roles, things like that. So there's not, one of the exciting things is there's not like a fixed way to do it. Just do interesting work. That's fun. That's my advice.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Rand is going to put into the chat a link to a short survey. It's literally one maybe 2 questions. And it really helps us in planning these talks. So thank you so much. And thank you, Sarah. This has been such a pleasure and brought together a lot of things that we've been talking about for a long time with a real depth of clarity. So we're incredibly grateful.
Thank you so much. It was really, really fantastic to be here.